Wong Jackman's guard was still rising when Bruce Lee's hand was already past it. 6 inches. That's as close as the strike came to full extension before it found him. And by the time the sound of it reached the back wall, the visiting master's feet had already left the floor. 40-some people lined that Oakland storefront room, and not one of them blinked. Some of them would spend the rest of their lives swearing they never actually saw the blow land, only what came after. A challenger who had crossed the bay to end a young man's career going down. And a young man who put him there, not smiling about it. This is how it began. You've probably heard a version of this fight before. Forget it. Here's the one they tell in the back rooms of old dojos. The one that outlived every person who was standing against those walls that afternoon. Nobody can prove a word of what follows. That has never once stopped anybody from telling it anyway. I'm the latest one telling it. Stay with me. Oakland, 1964. A storefront on a quiet stretch of street. Glass front painted with gold characters. A single overhead bulb. A floor swept twice a day by a 23-year-old instructor who had opened it against everyone's advice. The sign on the door said, June Fan Gung Fu Institute. What it didn't have to say, because everyone in Chinatown across the water already knew it, was who was allowed to walk through that door. Bruce taught anyone who showed up ready to work. Black students, white students, a Japanese-American kid who'd shown up limping from another school that turned him away, a Filipino longshoreman built like a doorframe. This was not how it was done. Kung Fu, the old men across the bay would tell you, quietly, over tea, was not a public service. It was a family inheritance, passed hand to hand, generation to generation, and it did not belong on a storefront with a bell on the door, where anyone with a few dollars could walk in and learn what centuries of masters had died protecting. Bruce didn't see it that way. He saw a room full of people who wanted to get better at something real, and a tradition that had spent 300 years being precious about a body of knowledge that, in his opinion, mostly just needed better footwork. He said things like that out loud. That was part of the problem. Word of the storefront reached San Francisco the way word always does. Slowly, then all at once, carried by a dozen mouths until the story, arriving on the other end, barely resembled the one that left. By the time it crossed the bay, a young teacher explaining Gung Fu principles to non-Chinese students in plain English had become, depending on who was telling it, an insult to 5 schools at once, a threat to the entire community's right to guard its own knowledge, or worse version, the one that actually mattered. Proof that a whole generation of young Chinese Americans no longer respected what their fathers had carried across an ocean. Here's what gets me about this part of the story. Nobody accused Bruce of teaching badly. That was never the complaint. The complaint was that he was teaching it all to the wrong people in the wrong language for the wrong reasons, and that this alone was worth silencing. Somewhere in San Francisco's Chinatown, a decision was made, not by one man, by a room of them, elders, masters, men whose names most of that later crowd in Oakland never learned, and whose reasoning nobody ever fully agreed on afterward. What they agreed on, what history actually kept a record of, was the outcome. A letter would be sent, or a visitor, or both, depending on which version of the legend you're standing closest to. Nobody agrees, even now, on exactly how that message crossed the bay. A letter, some versions say formal, brief, delivered by hand to the storefront door on an otherwise ordinary weekday afternoon. A visit, say others, a quiet, unannounced conversation, conducted in low voices near the back of the room while a class was still finishing up front, close enough that a couple of students noticed something was wrong without ever hearing a single word of it. For seconds, that's about how long, by one telling, Bruce is supposed to have gone quiet after hearing the terms out loud for the first time. Long enough for whoever delivered them to wonder if he'd understood. Long enough for the room around him, if there was a room around him, to feel it too. The man they chose to carry, it was named Wong Jackman. He was not sent as a bully. That detail matters, and the myth tends to drop it because a clean villain is easier to root against than a serious man doing an unpleasant job he'd been asked to do. Wong was trained, respected, and by every honest account, calm about the whole thing. A martial artist with real credentials, sent across the bay to deliver an ultimatum with the same courtesy you'd use to deliver bad news to a friend. The ultimatum, as the story's been passed down, came in two parts. Stop teaching non-Chinese students or accept a challenge match. Lose that match, and the school closes, or Bruce agrees to teach only Chinese students going forward, depending again on which telling you trust. Win it, and Chinatown leaves him alone for good. 3 hours after that ultimatum reached him, Bruce had already picked a date. He didn't ask his students what they thought. He didn't sleep on it. Some things in this legend he answered before the question finished being asked, and this was one of them. 3 days later. That's the gap the old version of this story gives you, and I'll be honest with you the way I intend to be honest with you all the way through this one. I don't think anybody actually timed it. 3 days is close enough to true that nobody's bothered correcting it in 60 years. Word moved through the storefront's regulars fast. Faster than Bruce could have controlled even if he'd wanted to, which he didn't. A challenge was coming. A real one. Not a demonstration. Not a friendly exchange between styles for the benefit of onlookers. San Francisco was sending someone to end this. The room that had once held maybe 15 students on a busy night suddenly needed to hold twice that. People who hadn't set foot in the school in months found reasons to stop by. Community elders who'd never once watched Bruce teach a class arranged, very casually, to be in the neighborhood that particular afternoon. Everyone wants the fight to be real. Nobody asks why they need it to be. Here's why, if you're asking. Because this wasn't a sporting exhibition with a trophy at the end of it. This was a young man's entire right to keep doing the one thing he'd built his whole adult life around. Argued out on a swept wooden floor in front of an audience that had already decided, mostly, what they expected to see happen to him. Look at it from the other side for a second. From Wong Jackman's side, standing in his own doorway across the bay a few days earlier, being asked to go settle something that wasn't personal to him at all. He wasn't defending an insult to his own name. He was defending an idea that some things should stay guarded, that some doors shouldn't open just because a crowd wants to walk through them. Whatever else this story turns him into by the end, that part of him deserves to be said plainly once before the rest of it happens. He believed he was right. The terms, once they were actually agreed on, were specific in the way that only matters to two people and blurs in a legend for everyone else. A private match, not a public spectacle, whatever the packed room might suggest, since half of that room technically wasn't supposed to be there at all. Witnesses on both sides, to keep the outcome from becoming a matter of one man's word against another's. And this is the detail every retelling agrees on, oddly, more than almost any other, no time limit. It would end when one man could no longer continue, or when one side conceded. That single detail, no clock, no round, no bell, is the whole reason this story is still being told 60 years later. Keep that in your pocket. It matters more than the punch that ends it. 40 minutes in, on any given weeknight before any of this started, that storefront looked nothing like the site of a career-ending confrontation. It looked like a room full of people getting better at something, badly, patiently, together. A young man named Danny who worked the docks and came in still smelling of rope and salt. A schoolteacher's son who'd been turned away from 2 other schools in the neighborhood before he found this one, for reasons nobody bothered explaining to his face. A grandmother's grandson who Bruce, by more than one account, refused to let quit even when the kid begged to. None of them were Chinese. That was, in the plainest possible terms, the entire complaint. Bruce had a phrase he used with his own students, one that a few of them still remember decades later. Word for word, the way you remember things said to you exactly once at exactly the right moment. Research your own experience, he'd tell them. Absorb what is useful. Discard what is useless. Add what is specifically your own. That sentence, on its own, sounds harmless enough to print on a coffee mug today. In 1964, coming from a 23-year-old teaching it to a mixed classroom on the wrong side of a bay, it sounded, to the men who eventually sent Wong Jackman to correct it, like heresy dressed up as pedagogy. Here's what the polished versions of this story tend to skip past, because it complicates a clean underdog narrative. Bruce wasn't naive about the risk he was taking. He knew exactly what teaching outsiders would cost him socially, long before anyone crossed a bay to collect on it. He did it anyway, not as a protest, not as a statement, but because he'd apparently decided, quietly, on his own, sometime before any of this became a public argument, that a door worth guarding that closely probably wasn't worth guarding at all. That's a harder position to hold than it sounds. It's easy to defy tradition in the abstract. It's a different thing entirely to do it in a small storefront with your name on the lease, knowing a formal delegation might one day walk through that door specifically to make you regret it. By the time that delegation actually arrived, in the form of one calm, serious man carrying an ultimatum instead of a threat, Bruce had already been living with the consequences of his own decision for the better part of 2 years. What changed wasn't the principle. What changed was that somebody, finally, was going to make him defend it in a language everyone in that room would understand without a single word of translation. The night before, Bruce didn't do anything you'd put in a movie. He didn't stand on a rooftop. He didn't stare into a mirror delivering a speech to himself. By every account that survived, and there aren't many because the people closest to him that night mostly kept it to themselves for the rest of their lives, he ran through the same footwork drills he ran every night in the same empty storefront under the same single bulb for roughly the same amount of time. The only thing different, according to the one friend who was there and occasionally mentioned it decades later, was how quiet he was doing it. He wasn't nervous. That friend is supposed to have said, near the end of his own life, to whoever was still around to ask him about it. I've seen him nervous. This wasn't that. This was somebody doing arithmetic in his head and not liking one of the numbers. Take that for what it's worth. I do. Morning came the way mornings do in stories like this one. Too fast for everyone except the man at the center of it, who by every account slept fine. By the time the first witnesses started arriving, the storefront had already been rearranged. Training equipment pushed to the walls. A rough square of open floor in the middle, big enough for 2 men to move, small enough that neither one could run from the other for long. No mats, no padding, just varnished wood that had been swept. According to one detail that keeps surviving every retelling for reasons I can't fully explain, except that it's exactly specific enough to feel true, twice that morning instead of once. 40-some people by the time the door was finally shut. Students, a handful of elders who'd made the trip specifically to watch a young upstart get put back in his place. A few who'd come hoping for the opposite, quietly, without saying so out loud. The room smelled like it always smelled on a busy morning. Wood polish, chalk dust from the line marked along one wall, the particular mustiness of a converted storefront that had been a laundry before it was anything else. A couple of the elders stood near the door rather than sitting, the posture of men who wanted to be able to leave quickly if what they were about to see embarrassed them. A couple of students stood near the front for the opposite reason, close enough to see everything, whatever it turned out to be. Danny, the dock worker, found a spot along the near wall and stayed there the entire time, according to the one account that ever mentioned him by name. He's one of maybe 4 people from that whole crowd whose names survived this story at all. Everyone else became a witness, a student, someone who was there, the way most names do, eventually once a room turns into a legend. And somewhere in that crowd, doing what witnesses in every story like this one eventually do, standing a little too still, saying nothing, already deciding what they'd tell people afterward before anything had actually happened yet. 2 men stepped into that square of open floor. One of them had come across a bay to close a door he believed shouldn't be open. The other had spent his whole short adult life making sure it stayed that way. Neither one bowed like it was ceremony. This wasn't ceremony anymore. 3 minutes. That's the number that gets repeated more than any other number in this entire story. 3 minutes, start to finish, decisive, clean. I want to be straight with you before we go one sentence further, because that's the deal I'm making with you for the whole time we're together today. That number is the least reliable part of this whole legend, and I think the reason people keep repeating it anyway is more interesting than whether it's actually true. Some witnesses swore it was over before anyone could count to 200. Others, and there were people in that room who lived another 40, 50 years and never stopped arguing about this exact point at family dinners, insisted it went on close to half an hour, long enough that spectators started shifting their weight from foot to foot. Nobody in that room, 6 decades later, has ever fully agreed on how long it actually lasted. What almost everybody agrees on is how it started. Distance first, both men circling the edge of that square, feeling for range the way 2 men do when neither one has seen the other's hands move in earnest before. Wong's stance was rooted, traditional, weight low and settled, built for absorbing force and returning it with interest. Bruce's stance was almost insultingly loose by comparison. Weight even, hands low, nothing raised in the classical guard the older art would have expected from him. He wasn't posturing for the crowd. He never postured for the crowd. That looseness was the whole point. A guard held high tells your opponent exactly where your hands intend to go before they get there. Hands held low tell him nothing, and cost you nothing to move from. The first real exchange came fast, and it came from Wong. A probing strike, testing distance more than committing to damage. The kind of opening move 2 serious fighters throw at each other to find out what the other one actually does under pressure, not what he says he does. Bruce didn't retreat from it. He also didn't meet it head on the way the room half expected. He shifted, a small lateral step, barely visible if you weren't watching his feet specifically, which most of that crowd wasn't, and the strike that should have found him found empty air instead, close enough that a few people near the front swore afterward they'd heard the wind of it. That's calculus, not courage. Bruce Lee stands in the center of a room with 40-some people watching him and does not raise his hands, and you're supposed to read that as fear. It wasn't fear. It was arithmetic. He'd already done the math on how much force it costs to hold a guard up versus how little it costs to simply not be where the strike is going. He'd chosen the cheaper option, and cheap, in a fight with no time limit, is the whole game. The next several exchanges, by the accounts that have survived, moved fast enough that most of that crowd along the walls couldn't have told you afterward, honestly, exactly what order anything happened in. That's a detail worth trusting, oddly, precisely because it's unflattering to the storyteller in me. A clean legend wants you to believe every witness saw every beat clearly. The truth, whenever real violence happens in a real room, is closer to what actually got reported here. A blur of motion, a handful of frozen images that stuck in different people's memories for different reasons, and very little agreement about the order they belonged in. What several accounts do agree on, oddly, is the sound of it before the sight of it. More than one witness, describing this decades apart from each other with no apparent contact between them, mentioned that the room seemed to hear Wong's counters before it saw them. A short exhale, sharp, controlled, The kind of sound a well-trained fighter makes on purpose to time his own breath to his own strike. Bruce's exhale, by contrast, according to the same handful of accounts, barely registered at all. Not because he wasn't working as hard, because economy, for him, extended even to the sound his own effort was allowed to make. Wong answered Bruce's first evasion with a low, compact counter aimed at closing the very gap Bruce had just opened. The correct response, textbook even, to a fighter who'd just proven he could not be reached by a straight line. Bruce met it by giving ground at an angle rather than retreating straight back, a half step that cost him almost nothing and denied Wong the exact reset he needed to plant and drive again. This went on, by every telling, longer than either man expected it to. Add fear to the equation here, because this is exactly where it belongs. Not fear of losing outright, but the quieter, more specific fear that lives in a young man discovering, in real time, in front of the one audience he could least afford to disappoint, that his opponent was better prepared for him than he'd allowed himself to plan for. Now factor in the reputation on the line on both sides of that square at once. Wong wasn't fighting for himself alone. He carried an entire delegation's authority into that room with him, and every second the fight stretched past whatever quick resolution they'd all quietly expected was a second that authority looked less certain. Bruce wasn't just fighting for the lease on a storefront. He was fighting in front of the exact community that doubted he had any right to run it for the plain fact of his own competence. Two men, each one carrying weight that had nothing to do with the 6 inches of open floor directly between their hands. Here's what I think most retellings get quietly wrong about this stretch of the fight, and it's worth saying because it changes how you should picture the room. It wasn't ugly. It wasn't a brawl, whatever the chair going over might make it sound like. Both men were still moving with real technique, real training, real control over what their bodies were doing at every single instant. It was simply technique meeting technique that had never been tested against exactly this kind of pressure before from either side. That's a harder thing to stage than a clean knockout. And it's the reason, I think, that everyone who was actually in that room remembered it more vividly than the neat, 3-minute version that eventually got repeated everywhere else. But there's one thing the terms of this match never accounted for, and it's the thing that turns this from a clean legend into a messy, honest one, the kind mythmakers like me actually prefer telling, if I'm being straight with you. Wong Jackman did not go down easily, and more than that, more importantly than that, he did not go down quickly, and this single fact is the reason the rest of Bruce's life took the turn it took. Add fear to the equation now. Not fear of losing, but the specific fear that lives underneath every young man who has staked his whole future on being right in public. Bruce landed strikes. Real ones, clean ones, the kind that should have folded a lesser fighter in half. Wong absorbed them, backed off, circled, and kept his feet. Here's what the legend rarely slows down long enough to admit. A fight that should have been a demonstration of superior technique started somewhere around the second or third exchange to look like a scramble instead. Wong began backing toward the wall. Away from the open center of the square, both men had agreed to fight inside. Bruce followed. The crowd along that wall had to shuffle backward themselves to keep from becoming part of it. A folding chair went over. Nobody in that room, 6 decades of retelling later, has ever agreed on whose foot actually caught it. This is the part the polished versions of this legend leave out, and it's the part one trusts the most precisely because it makes nobody look good. Bruce Lee, 23 years old, faster, better conditioned, throwing the cleaner technique by every honest account, could not simply end this the way he'd pictured ending it in his head the night before. Wong Jackman kept moving, kept turning, kept refusing to be where the finishing strike expected him to be. the same way Bruce himself had refused to be where the opening strike expected him to be. Two men who both understood the same principle, both trying to use it against each other at the same time. That's not a story about a stronger man beating a weaker one. That's a story about two students of the same idea, and only one of them was going to walk out of that square able to say he'd proven it. Flip it around for a second and watch it from inside Wong Jackman's stance instead of Bruce's. A serious man, trained since childhood in a tradition that valued rootedness above almost everything else, suddenly finding that rootedness itself being used as the very thing his opponent kept redirecting past. Every time Wong planted to generate power, Bruce wasn't there to receive it. Every time Wong reset to a stable base, the ground he was resetting onto had already shrunk by another half step, because Bruce's footwork kept closing the square from angles a traditional guard simply wasn't built to track. That's not weakness in Wong's approach. It's worth saying plainly because this legend has spent 60 years being unfair to him in exactly this spot. He was doing exactly what generations of serious martial artists before him had done, and doing it well. He had simply never faced anyone who'd spent as many hours as Bruce had, alone, under one bulb, specifically studying how to make that kind of rootedness cost its owner more than earned him. One witness, and I want to be honest, that witness here means somebody who told somebody who eventually told me, which is exactly the chain this whole legend runs on. Put years later this way, I trained under men like Wong my whole life. I'd never seen anyone make a good stance look like a mistake before that afternoon. Maybe he said exactly that. Maybe it's been sanded smooth by 40 years of retelling into something quotable enough to survive. I can't verify it, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I'm telling you anyway because it's the version that's outlived every other one, and because whatever else is true or isn't, the shape of it matches what almost everyone in that room agreed actually happened, even when they couldn't agree on how long it took. Look at it from the room's perspective for a second. 40-some people who'd come expecting a clean verdict inside a minute, watching instead as two men chased each other around a shrinking square of open floor, breathing harder, sweat visible under that single overhead bulb. The whole thing looking less like the demonstrations painted on movie posters and a great deal more like exactly what it was: two serious men trying very hard in real time to hurt each other just enough to end it and not 1 inch more. That's the theory these men had both been taught. Here's the practice: messier, longer, and far more human than either one of them had planned for. Somewhere past the point where Bruce had expected this to already be over, something shifted in him. Not panic. The witnesses who talked about it later, decades on, were careful to say it wasn't panic. It was closer to irritation, the specific, private frustration of a man watching his own execution fall short of his own standard in front of exactly the audience he most needed to impress. He stopped chasing angles and started closing distance instead. Simpler, cruder, by his own standard, though nobody in that room could have told the difference. A flurry, not the single decisive strike the legend likes to promise you, but 3, 4, 5 in close succession, forcing Wong back against the wall the crowd had already cleared for him without meaning to. The observation that survived best out of everything anyone in that room ever said afterward came from a man who never gave his name to anyone who later tried to write any of this down. He put to a friend of a friend, decades on, this way: I've watched a lot of fights. That wasn't a fight anymore near the end. That was one man doing math and the other man running out of variables. Maybe that's exactly how it happened. Maybe it isn't. That's the myth doing its work either way, smoothing a scramble into a sentence clean enough to repeat at a dinner table 60 years later. Wong's back met the wall. There was nowhere left in that square to go that wasn't through Bruce or through the crowd standing directly behind him, and by every account, however long this had actually taken by that point, both men knew it at the exact same moment. This is the moment the legend has been circling since the first sentence of this story. Slow it down with me. Distance closed to almost nothing. Wong's weight shifted, committing to one last exchange rather than one more retreat. The decision every cornered fighter eventually has to make, and by most accounts he made it without hesitation, which is worth remembering the next time this story tempts you to make him small. Bruce's hand was already moving before that shift finished. Low line, driving upward and through, weight transferring from the ball of his back foot through his hip in one continuous piece of motion rather than the two-part telegraph a less trained fighter throws. Biomechanically, this is the whole secret, and it is not mystical, whatever the version of this story you heard as a teenager wants you to believe. Force generated from the ground up, transferred through a stable hip, arriving at the target a fraction of a second before the eye can track the arm that carried it. Not magic, not a movie effect, just a body that had spent years being drilled out of every wasted motion an untrained fighter carries without noticing. Wong's guard was still rising when it landed. You already know where this goes because I told you at the very start of this story. 6 inches of travel, a man's feet leaving the wooden floor beneath him. 40-some people along the walls of an Oakland storefront, not one of them breathing. And then, nothing. No triumphant shout. No fist raised over a fallen man for the benefit of a crowd that had come specifically hoping to see one. Bruce stood exactly where the technique had left him, hands still low, and watched Wong Jackman go down onto a floor that had been swept twice that morning for exactly this possibility. Here's what actually decided this fight, and it wasn't the punch. It was what happened in the 3 or 4 seconds directly afterward, and almost nobody who tells this story slows down long enough to sit inside them. Wong did not get up right away. He also, by every honest account, did not stay down out of surrender. He stayed down because his body, for a handful of seconds, genuinely could not do anything else. And Bruce Lee, 23 years old, breathing hard, standing over the man who'd been sent across a bay specifically to end his career, did not close the distance to finish it further. He didn't need to. That's the whole point, and it's the point this legend has been building towards since the very first sentence. The strongest man in that room was the one who could have done a great deal more, standing directly over a man who could not yet stop him from doing it, and chose not to. Somebody in that crowd, a witness who never let his name attach to any version of this that got written down, and honestly, I trust him more for it, is supposed to have said years later, when someone finally asked him directly what he remembered, "I've been in rooms with a lot of fighters." That wasn't restraint out of mercy. That was a man who'd already gotten what he came for, and understood exactly how little there was left to prove by taking more. Maybe he really said that. Maybe somebody smoothed it into something quotable over 40 years of retelling. I can't prove either way. I'm telling you anyway, because it's the version that's outlived every other one. And that has to mean something, even if it isn't proof of anything at all. Wong Jackman got back to his feet under his own power, roughly half a minute later, by most tellings. Nobody in that room, 6 decades on, has ever agreed on the exact number, and I've stopped expecting them to. What almost every account does agree on is what he did next. And it's the detail that turns this from a story about winning into a story about something considerably more interesting. He didn't argue the outcome. He didn't ask for a second round, or claim a foul, or do any of the small, understandable, human things a man in his position might have reasonably done in front of 40-some witnesses who just watched him lose. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Bruce for a moment, long enough that a couple of witnesses near the front specifically remembered it, decades later, as the part of the whole afternoon that stayed with him longest, and he gave a short, formal nod. The kind two serious men give each other when something has actually been settled, and both of them know it. That's who arrived at that door an hour earlier, sent to close a young teacher's school by whatever means the terms required. This is who left it, a man who had lost, and lost in front of witnesses whose whole purpose for being there was to watch him do exactly that, and who chose, in the moment it would have cost him nothing to choose otherwise, to leave with his dignity fully intact. I want to give him that plainly before this story moves on without him. Whatever else this legend turns him into in the retellings that came after, and it turns him into plenty, not all of it fair. Wong Jackman walked out of that Oakland storefront the same way he walked in. A serious man who believed he was right, who turned out to be wrong about the outcome, and who did not let that turn him into anyone smaller than he already was. The room he left behind did not stay quiet for long. 40-some people who'd spent however many minutes not breathing suddenly found their voices all at once. Students who'd trained under Bruce for a year found themselves grabbing strangers by the shoulder to ask if they'd seen the same thing they'd just seen. A couple of the community elders who'd made the trip specifically hoping to watch an upstart get corrected filed out quietly, without commentary, which, depending on which old-timer you ask, all these decades later, was either the most respectful thing they could have done or the loudest silence in the whole story. 0. That's how many times, by every account that survived, Bruce raised his voice through any of it. Not during the fight, and not in the noise that followed it. He accepted a few hands on his shoulder. He answered a few questions with fewer words than the people asking them probably wanted. And somewhere in the crush of that celebration, his students, his few friends, the small crowd that had come expecting a funeral and gotten a coronation instead, he started, quietly, without announcing it to anybody, to leave. The elders who'd stayed to the end, the ones who'd made the trip specifically hoping to watch an upstart get corrected, didn't argue with what they'd just seen. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it would have been easy for this legend to give them a villain's exit, a muttered threat, a promise that this wasn't over. Almost nobody who tells this story that way is being honest with you. By most accounts, they simply left the way serious people leave a verdict they didn't expect but can't reasonably dispute. Whatever they said to each other on the ferry back across the bay that night never made it into any version of this story anyone kept. That's the part that tells you the most about what had actually happened in that room, if you ask me. Not the punch, the silence that followed it, from the exact people who'd had every reason to make noise. By the following morning, before Bruce had even opened the storefront for his regular Monday class, the story was already traveling without him. That's the part of this legend I find myself thinking about more than almost any other detail in it. How fast a version of that afternoon started moving through Chinatown, through the dojos, through the handful of martial arts circles scattered around the Bay Area that have been watching this whole standoff from a careful distance. And how, by the third or fourth retelling, the fight itself had already started changing shape. The 3 minute stretched. The single flurry became, in some mouths, a string of blows too fast to count. The chair that went over became, in one version I've personally heard secondhand decades later, an entire rack of training weapons. Nobody set out to lie about what happened that afternoon. That's important to say plainly, because it's the whole difference between a myth and a fabrication. Every person retelling it believed, honestly, that they were passing along something close to the truth. They simply couldn't help shaping it, a little, toward the version that made the most sense of what they'd felt standing against that wall. That's not dishonesty. That's just what happens to any true thing, once enough people who care about it start carrying it forward for you. Here's what I think is the most honest thing anybody has ever said about what happened next. And I think it matters more than the punch, more than the terms, more than any of the numbers this whole legend keeps arguing about. A friend who stayed until the room finally emptied. The same one, by some tellings, who'd noticed how quiet Bruce had been the night before, is supposed to have said that Bruce didn't linger, didn't hold court, didn't do any of the things a 23-year-old who just defended his entire future in front of a packed room might reasonably have wanted to do that night. He thanked the people who deserved thanking, locked the door behind the last of them, and walked back into a room that an hour earlier had held 40-some people holding their breath, and now held exactly one. Let me take you into that room with him for a second, because this is the part of the story that made me want to tell it in the first place, not the fight. The overhead bulb was still on. The floor, swept twice that morning, was scuffed now in places it hadn't been scuffed before. Small arcs and skid marks near the wall where a folding chair had gone over, where two men's feet had fought for the same 6 inches of space more than once. Bruce didn't sweep it. He didn't practice. He stood roughly where he'd been standing when it ended, and by every account anyone ever managed to get out of him about that specific evening, which were few and brief, and mostly given years later to people he trusted, he looked down at his own hands for a long time. Not admiring them. That's the version a lesser storyteller would give you, and it's wrong. He was looking at them the way you look at a tool that just did exactly what you asked it to do, and cost you something you weren't expecting to pay. Here's what gets me about this part, every single time I tell it. He'd won, not narrowly, not by luck, not by a questionable ruling, not by anything a witness could later dispute in good faith. He'd stood in a room in front of 40-some people and ended a serious man's challenge with a technique that any honest observer in that crowd would tell you was clean and decisive and exactly as advertised. And it hadn't felt like the ending he needed it to be. Strip away the myth for a moment, the way I'm asking you to strip it away with me right here, and look at what's actually left underneath it. A young man alone in an empty room, having just proven in the most public and undeniable way available to him, that he could do the one thing his entire adult life had been organized around proving, and finding in the quiet immediately afterward, that the proof didn't sit the way he'd expected it to sit. It had taken too long, longer than a minute, however many minutes it actually was, and I've told you honestly, I don't think anybody in that room could tell you the real number if you asked them under oath. It had gotten messy in the middle, chairs going over, both men scrambling for a wall that wasn't supposed to be part of the fight at all. It had needed a flurry near the end instead of the single clean technique he'd pictured delivering the night before, alone, running the same footwork drills he ran every night under this exact bulb. He had won the argument. He had not won the version of himself he'd walked into that room expecting to be. The bulb hummed. Somewhere outside, a streetcar passed, and the sound of it moved through the empty room the way sound moves through any room that's just gone quiet after being loud. Dust, disturbed by however many bodies had crowded that floor an hour earlier, still hadn't fully settled. He could see it, if he looked, drifting slow through the single cone of light hanging over the center of the square, where none of this had gone the way he'd rehearsed it. 23 years old, a signed lease, a room full of people who trusted him with something real and had just watched him defend that trust in front of the people most determined to take it from him. By any measure anyone in that emptied storefront would have offered him that night. He had exactly what he'd come for. He ran the fight again in his head anyway. Not once. By every account anyone ever coaxed out of him about this specific evening, he ran it more than once. The opening exchange, the scramble toward the wall, the chair going over, the flurry he needed instead of the single clean line he'd drilled the night before under this same bulb. Each time he ran it, the same handful of seconds kept snagging on themselves, refusing to smooth out the way the rest of the memory wanted to. Here's the plain arithmetic of it, stripped down to the number that actually mattered to him, whatever the room full of witnesses believed mattered. He had needed too many motions to finish what one clean motion should have finished. That gap between the fighter he'd trained every night alone to become and the fighter who'd actually shown up in that square when it counted was small enough that nobody else in that room would ever notice it, and large enough that he was never again going to be able to not notice it himself. That crack, small, private, entirely his own, visible to absolutely nobody who'd been cheering for him 20 minutes earlier, is the real center of this whole legend, more than the punch that ends it, more than the nod Wong Jack man gave him on the way out the door. Everyone in that room got the ending they came for. Bruce Lee, alone in an empty storefront with a bulb he hadn't bothered turning off yet, did not. He stood there long enough that whatever he was thinking never fully made it into any account anyone else ever gave. That's not a gap in the story. That's the story respecting the one part of it that was never anybody else's to tell. What happened to that quiet crack over the months that followed? What it turned into, what he built out of it, alone, in a room not unlike this one, is a different legend for a different night. I'll tell you that one too, if you stay with me long enough. But it starts here in this exact silence, with a young man who just won the only way that mattered and still hadn't found whatever it was he actually came into that room looking for. Years later, when Bruce Lee had become the kind of name that didn't need a last name attached to it, people who'd stood along those walls that afternoon found themselves telling this story differently, depending on who was asking. To reporters, it became clean and cinematic. The fight the way legends prefer their fights, 3 minutes, one clear winner, no wasted motion. To their own grandchildren, decades on, a few of them told a raw version instead. The chair going over, the scramble toward the wall, a young man who'd looked for one specific handful of seconds, entirely human and entirely unsure. Both versions came from the same room. Both versions, in their own way, were true to what the person telling them needed that afternoon to mean. That's not a flaw in how this story survived. That's the whole reason it survived at all. A fight that had ended in one clean, forgettable technique. No chair, no scramble, no crack afterward, probably wouldn't still be argued about in dojo back rooms 60 years later. It's the mess in the middle, the part every polished retelling wants to sand away, that gave people something worth arguing over for 6 decades. Perfect stories get repeated once and forgotten. Complicated ones get passed hand to hand like something valuable. You already know where this goes. If you've spent any time at all around people who tell this story, eventually every single one of them gets to the same fork in the road. Half of them want to argue about how long the fight actually lasted. The other half, the ones I find myself trusting more with every year I spend collecting versions of this, skip straight past that argument entirely and go looking instead for the part that made a 23-year-old stand alone in an empty room afterward, looking at his own hands, unsatisfied with a victory that everyone else in his life would have called complete. I'm one of the second kind. That's probably obvious by now. So, how much of that actually happened the way I just told it to you? Honestly, almost none of it in the specific way I told it. This is a legend, dramatized and largely imagined. A story I tell, not a record of him. Whether the fight lasted 3 minutes or 20, whether a chair really went over, whether anyone actually said the things I put in their mouths tonight, none of that survived in any form solid enough to call a fact. Even the people who were supposedly in that room never agreed with each other about most of it for the rest of their lives. But here's what I'd bet my life is real underneath every version of this story anyone has ever told. A young man walked into a room that day needing to prove something to people who doubted he had the right to teach it all. He won, cleanly, in front of every witness who mattered. And somewhere in the quiet that came after, a quiet no crowd ever saw, no witness ever fully described, no version of this legend has ever managed to improve on. he discovered that winning wasn't the same thing as being at peace with how he'd won. That part, I bet my life, is real. Some men become legends because of what they did. Bruce became one because of what he chose not to do. Until the next legend. If this one got you, there are more legends where this came from. Subscribe, and I'll keep telling them.